We're going to begin the installation of the counter-rotating balance shaft. Kind of giving you this view so you can see the shaft slide through the block. I don't know if there's a good or a bad view on this job, but that's what we got. Here's the counter-rotating balance shaft. We purchased this secondhand, used, salvage. Cleaned it well, a little polish on the bearing surfaces. Looks really good. Gear's intact. It's actually got a bolt in it, unlike our other one that we just took off of here. So we're going to install this. Now look, there's an installer tool that basically goes over the end of this gear, gives you a handle, and lets you move this thing, manipulate it pretty easily. If you're doing a full rebuild, it's fairly accessible down through the valley here in the block, and so that's what we're gonna rely on. But we also need to make sure that our thrust plate here is set so that when it goes in, it's in the right orientation, or it'll be blocked. Put it in like this, wrong, like this, right. So we're going to go ahead and begin the install. We have added assembly lube to the front and the rear bearings, and the entire goal here is just to get the front and rear bearings engaged without damaging the front bearing, passing through the front bearing. So it's really not too tough. You just at this point in the rebuild, you have reasonable access, so you should be able to get it in without a special tool. Now if the crank was in here and the pistons were in here, there's no getting down to this valley. Be a trickier job. So we've got to get the rear bearing lined up and the front bearing lined up, and then we're installed. It's just that simple. Rotate smooth against the bearing surfaces. So that was fairly straightforward. Let's go see what we can do about go ahead and bolting it up for good. Alright, well, we've got the two bolts that hold this little wonder in. One of these bolts also is part of the timing chain tensioner system. That's the one on the right hand side of the block. And so for this one, we just use it as a guide pin basically, so that we can install the other bolt, the smaller bolt, into the opposite side of the thrust plate, and everything will be aligned. This will come back out whenever we install the tensioner system. It holds one of the tensioner shoes on this side. So this is in. We go to 20 foot-pounds of torque. Let me get an extension. So you tighten the one shorter bolt to 20 foot-pounds of torque. There you go. And then, like I said, the other bolt, it'll get tightened when we put in the timing chain tensioning system. So that part's done. The counter-rotating balance shaft is installed. It does turn smooth and free. We will reposition this gear later as part of acquiring proper timing as we assemble the timing system. So rotate it. Let's begin looking at installing the crank. Alright, well, we're going to install the crankshaft, of all silly things. So installing the crankshaft also means we need to install the tone ring on the crankshaft. We need to install the bearings into the block. We need to install the bearings into the bed plate, and including thrust washers into the block. So that's where we're going to get started. We're going to start by installing the bearings and thrust washers, and then go from there. The bearings and thrust washers just simply slip in. Hopefully you saw our video on select fit versus stock bearings for this motor. We made our decision and we're sticking to it. We're going to go with the stock bearings that were supplied with the rebuild kit, and then we're going to trust that our plastic gauge measurements were correct, and our oil pressure will tell us that, I feel confident. So simply slip in. There's a tab on the bearing surface here, and then there's a notch in the block, and those all fit together. Now the thrust washers, whenever I install thrust washers, I like to kind of glue them in place a little bit. They go here on bearing block number 2, and what I like to do is just put a little bit of assembly lube on the back. Helps hold them in place until we get the crank in there. Ultimately, the crank and the bed plate retain them, keep them from moving, coming out. But in the short term, I'll just use a little bit of assembly lube to simply hold them in place for us. It pretty much only can go in one way. Becomes quite obvious quite quickly the way they go in. Now watch me get it wrong or something after saying that, but so a little bit more assembly lube on the back of this one to help hold it in place. Stick it there. So again, thrust washers beside the number 2 main block, and there you go. So thrust washers in place, the mains are in place. Before I set the crank in, I always want to lubricate my mains with some assembly lube. I also lubricate the face of the thrust washers, so when it rotates against the crank at startup, no excessive wear. So we'll do that as well. Look, assembly lube is inexpensive, motors are not. So when you're putting one together, use plenty. It's not going to hurt a thing. It'll ultimately get solubilized by the oil, and then it'll be kind of out of your hair. So let's go ahead and lubricate these little guys good. Didn't cover it in the last video. I told you I was going to clean the block. After I've worked on the block, cleaned up gasket surfaces, you know, the machine guys, they coated it with oil. It was partially oil coated when I got it. I coated it with additional oil and then stored it away for a while till we got all our parts. But then once I started working with it, driving in, kind of rotating balance shaft bearings and the like, and also making sure the gasket surfaces were nice and clean, it picks up debris on the old surfaces. And so we need to do something to keep that debris out of our rebuild. And so what we do is, what I did was I rolled it outside. Sorry, I'm handling the crank here. I rolled it outside and used a paint sprayer and about half a gallon of mineral spirits to clean the block really well before we begin the reassembly. So right now the tone ring is here in the rear area of the crank. It needs to be bolted on. These bolts go, I believe it's 20 foot-pounds, 15 to 20 foot-pounds, something like that. So that needs to be bolted on, and then we can move forward with finishing the install on this crank. Get right back with you. Alright, so there's 3 bolts. 3 bolts that hold the crankshaft position target ring in place. They are T30 bolts. They get about 15 pounds of torque. We're gonna right now just buzz them up there and get it installed, and we'll torque them in a minute. But one thing to remember is this ring will only go on one way. So if you put it up there and line up one hole and the other 2 aren't lined up, rotate it one hole, still not lined up, rotate it one more hole, should line up in just a second. You only have 3 options, so just go ahead and run these up. And for now we're just trying to get them in place here in a hurry. And there's number 3. Alright, so that's installed. We'll give it a torque up here in a bit. You can see our crankshaft spinning quite freely. That's one thing we're going to track as we begin this install. We're going to track the resistance on the drive line as we add various components. It should get more resistive as you go, but if for some reason while you're assembling the motor, whether it's putting on the mains, putting in the pistons, if it locks up, you've got a problem. You've got a bad jammed rod or something like that. And spinning it, I just spun the thrust washers, so I'll fix that and get back with you in a minute. But what I like to do on these blocks is, before I go putting down the RTB sealant that seals the bed plate to the bottom of the block, it holds the crank in place and key part of the whole motor obviously, but before I go doing that, I like to set it on dry. I like to get all my bolts placed and aligned, because there are a number of bolts and they're not all the same size or style. So let me begin by showing you, here's our bed plate. Bed plate has the mains installed from when we plastic gauged them, and so it's ready to go on. So all we need to do is flip it, turn it, there we go, and then we can set it on, and we'll just guide our main blocks down, align the main blocks. Nope, I knew I forgot something. Before I do that, let me add assembly lube to these bearings, and then I'll get right back with you. Okay, got that worked out. Just about forgot to put on assembly lube, so got it on now, and we're ready to install bed plate. So basically you bring it down, aligning your mains as you go, and you're there. Now it's not resting on the gasket surface because of the dowel rods, the dowels that are there. But in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and try to start aligning our bolts. The bolts are location specific. Example, these two. That one rather. Let's see, where's the other one? There it is. And this one are doweled. Or not doweled. They have studs on top, and that's to hold the oil pickup tube in place, as well as hold the windage tray in place. So those two have specific locations. After that, got a large number of bolts that go around the outside, and just some general guidance. There's a series of bolts that are of larger diameter, look like these, and these go in the holes that are the larger diameter holes. So I'm just going to give them a quick spin, make sure I've got them in the right locations. Not going to tighten them up, not going to pull the bed plate down. Just wanting to make sure I locate my bolts correctly, so that everything, when I take it off, then I can RTB the sealing surface and know everything's going to be good. So I'll keep that up until we get the bolts located proper. Then we've got the smaller bolts. Two, three on this side. And we've got 1, 2 on this side. And basically it leaves one hole that doesn't have a bolt in it. And that would be this odd little bolt with a stud on it. Let me go see where it goes. No, it goes on here. Just don't know where. Alright, so that one stud bolt goes right here in this front corner. Should have remembered that. And then this other bolt goes here. So all our bolts are placed, we know where they go, their size is right. So what I like to do is I'll just set the bed plate off completely, come back now, RTV it, and then we can do a right proper install on the bed plate, which will then secure the crank, the main washers, the thrust washers. Basically that'll lead us to the place where we will be ready to install pistons. Come on out there. There we go. So we'll just set that out of our way. By the way, all the gasket surfaces were pre-cleaned. Everything's in good shape there. So let's get some RTV and see if we can get this thing together. Okay, so we installed a gray high temp oil resistant RTV as per the pattern in the book. Again, our manual shows us exactly how they want this bead laid out, and that's what we tried to do. So now it's for real. We're going to set the bed plate. There's no backing up. Well, okay, you can back up always, but no easy backing up from here. So we want to be sure we get it right, as right as we can get it. Alright, so we've got the alignment. We still have our dowel rods, our dowels holding us up. So I just try to seat it very carefully. Seat it down on the dowels. When I say carefully, we got mains in there, main bearings in there and the like. We don't want to be thumping too hard on this thing, but it's nice, pretty nice soft dead blow hammer. Doesn't give us a lot of vibration. So we're not all the way down, but we're real close. So now it's time to start this crazy torque procedure. Alright, to begin this procedure, we ran down these 13mm headed bolts that you see here, here, here. These small ones we've not yet dealt with. They'll come in next. So we begin, these go down to 40 foot-pounds in one smooth move, and they give you a numbering sequence, 1A, 1B. So we're going to do them in that order, taking them down to 40 foot-pounds. So the first one would be here. This will be 1A. And then 1B, opposite side. And then 1C. One D. And 1E. 1F. And 1G. That. And then H. And 1I. And 1J. And one thing you start to see, you see a nice smooth extrusion, hopefully. You see a nice smooth extrusion of your RTV, where you're pushing the RTV out, creating a nice uniform sealing surface. So we're going to go back through again just to make sure, which is my nature. 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1H, 1J, let me see, GH. Let me make sure we got that one. I think I missed this one. What you gonna do? We're just making sure we're tight, so. Okay, so those are all down and good. Now it's time to move to alright, so the next thing you do is we torque the main bolts, and then later we'll come back and torque these little bolts which are labeled A through whatever. And so the mains, again, you have a sequence. We showed it when we did the plastic gauge, and basically it's 5 foot-pounds, which is ridiculously low, but it's 5 foot-pounds, and then 90 degrees. So we just step through that process in the order specified. There's such a low torque spec on the initial setting that it's almost scary. Alright, so then from here, it's an additional 90 degrees. As I showed you in the plastic gauge video, I've got my wonderful 24-inch breaker bar, which I like to use. 90 degrees, like that. One of these days I'm going to have to break down and buy me a torque angle gauge, but I hadn't yet. So we're going to go through all the bolts and finish up this 90-degree portion. And it's done. All the mains are torqued. So the last series of bolts on installing the crank and the bed plate are these small 10 millimeter bolts. The last ones you tighten, they tighten to 20 foot-pounds of torque, and a pattern noted in your book, assuming you have a book. Alright, so the 10 millimeters are tightened and bed plate is secure, crank is secure. As I talked about earlier, this is when you want to be sure and check rotation and make sure that you don't have any issues with the bearings locking up the crank. And it spins freely, certainly doesn't spin sloppy. From this point, we're going to look at the end play on the crank, and assuming the end play is good, then we'll move on to installing the pistons. With that, we'll be in another video.